medicine, Hippocrates, uh, talked about the intestines as being the origin of all illness. And I don't know how he knew this, but modern science is beginning to show that in many respects, Hippocrates was correct. And a lot of this starts with the incredible genetic diversity of the microbiota, in particular, the microorganisms that live inside the large intestine. Now, they are genetically very diverse. Uh, Humans contain between 20 and 25,000 genes, but the microbes, those in the large intestine, account for more than 12 million genes. So the vast majority of the genes in you as a whole organism, as a host system, the vast majority are not human genes, they are microbial. They account for much more than half, much more, of all the metabolic reactions that are occurring inside you. So what do these genes code for? Well, a gene codes for a protein. And many of these genes are coding for proteins, which are enzymes. So out of these 12 million genes, they code for many enzymes which are producing tens of thousands of different metabolites in the intestine. It's a very complicated chemical mixture. Now, some of those compounds are very important for our health, a few of them, but many of them are potentially very toxic. So when we made a bargain with our microbes to produce useful compounds for us, in some ways, it was a devil's bargain. They're producing many other compounds besides. Many of them are potentially very toxic, and so we have had to develop a lining of the intestine, which is called the gut epithelial barrier. It's a filtration system designed to let the good compounds, the useful compounds, pass into the blood, get into the rest of the body, but to prevent the toxic compounds from entering so that they remain in the intestine where they do not harm us. As I said, this is the gut epithelial barrier system. It's important that this barrier is functioning, but it can only function if you have the right microbes in the intestine. And in order to maintain that healthy population of microbes that in turn preserves the barrier, you must consume prebiotic fibers. Prebiotic fibers are fuel, growth compounds for probiotics that live inside us, which produce postbiotic compounds that we need for our health. But it all starts with prebiotic fiber. And if you have the right combination of microbes in the intestine, this is very healthy for the intestines, it's healthy for the liver, for the heart, for the brain. In fact, it's important for all other tissues. And to show you how important it is to have the right population of microbes, I'm going to show you the results of a very large study that was carried out on behalf of the World Health Organization in 2019. This was a very good study. I know some of the scientists who were involved, and I respect their expertise. They were able to show that amongst those people who were consuming higher intakes of fiber, this was extremely protective. And it was so protective that, in fact, it reduced the frequency of early death, which really means preventable death, by 30%. It's the most significant level of protection from any nutrient that I've ever seen. So these prebiotic fibers, in order to give you the right population of microbes in the intestine, are doing something very important for you. But then they broke down the figures in more detail. And they've said, well, the people who eat more fiber have 25% less bowel cancer, 20% less breast cancer. The risk of a heart attack was reduced by a quarter. The risk of a stroke was reduced by a quarter. In other words, more fibers, very protective. Eating less fibers exposes you to significantly more risk. But then other people, other scientists built on this, and they did other studies which showed that eating more fiber reduced the risk of dementia by 25%. It reduced the risk of fatty liver disease by between 20 and 30%. It reduced the risk of Parkinsonism. So eating more fibers, and particularly the right kinds of fibers, is hugely protective. It's more protective than any drug that the doctors could give you. It's more protective than all of the drugs. They could possibly kill you. And very recently, we've seen a new study which shows that if you eat more of the right kinds of fiber, it increases your chance of maintaining good health into old age by as much as a third. This is a whole range of benefits, an extraordinary range of benefits to be gained from a simple dietary addition. So what are the prebiotic fibers doing? Well, prebiotic fibers are a form of carbohydrate. And the bacteria that consume these fibers, we call them saccharolytic. So which are these healthy saccharolytic bacteria? Well, the lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, very familiar. You will see these in yogurt, in kefir, and in many probiotic products. But they're not the only probiotic species. There are many others. The fecal bacterium, Prausnitzii, Roseburia, intestinalis, Akkermansia, mucinifera, more and more. All of these bacteria have several key things in common. All of them consume prebiotic fiber, and they break those fibers down, and they produce postbiotic compounds, including short-chain fatty acids, such as butyrate, and a very interesting compound called IPA, or indole propionic acid. Now, butyric acid, the short-chain fatty acid butyrate, is very important for us. It is a powerful anti-inflammatory, so it reduces inflammation in the gut and other tissues as well, if you produce enough of it. But it is also very good at killing cancer cells. That's a good thing. That's a useful property. And it goes back to the WHO data that says if you eat more fiber, you're protected against cancer. So now we can begin to see why. But IPA has some other effects. It's also anti-inflammatory, but it is also a neuroprotectant. That is, it helps to preserve the health of nerve cells and brain tissue. And now going back to the WHO data, yep, they found that if you ate more fibers, it reduced the risk of dementia. If you have more fibers, you're producing more probiotics in the intestines, producing more IPA. IPA is protecting the brain. So we can see the chemistry and the clinical endpoints, they fit very well together. Now, the probiotic species that you're feeding inside you not only produce short-chain fatty acids and IPA, they produce many other compounds as well. They produce bacteriocins. And what they do is they keep down the numbers of unhealthy microorganisms, including Candida. They produce immunomodulators that improve the functioning of the immune system, helping to increase your resistance to infection. And they do many other things besides. So consuming more prebiotic fiber, on paper, it looks like a very, very good idea. But what is that actually doing to the microbes inside you? Well, if you consume prebiotic fiber, you don't digest this. It passes in the intestine, it passes down the middle of the intestine, the lumen, and the probiotic bacteria that live inside you, they go into the lumen of the gut, that is the center, to find their food, the prebiotic fibers, and they multiply and they produce all of these compounds that are so healthy for us, the butyrate, the IPA. And in this condition, you're eating lots of prebiotic fiber, you have lots of probiotic bacteria. The microbiota inside your intestines is your friend. It is having a very positive conversation with your cells, those that line the colon. Those are the square-looking objects along the bottom of the picture. And your cells, the colonocytes, are responding very positively. They, in turn, communicate with the liver, the blood system. This is a very protected and very supportive environment. The microbes are, in this case, are our friends. They're supporting our hearts, our brains, our immune systems. They're doing very, very positive things. The problem is we don't eat prebiotic fiber very much anymore. Now, we know that 2,000 years ago, there were cultures that were consuming approximately 130, 140 grams of prebiotic fiber a day. They clearly had their intestines full of probiotic bacteria, and we assume that they were very healthy. But we don't know for sure because they did not leave medical records. So we have to come closer to the present day. And let's go to the 19th century in Britain, a period which has been intensively studied. We know they did not consume quite as much prebiotic fiber. Instead of 130, maybe they were consuming only 30 grams. But we do know a lot about their health. And we know that in that time, there was really no evidence that we could find of irritable bowel syndrome or inflammatory bowel disease, which has become so common today. At that time, when they were consuming those prebiotic fibers and they had a healthy microbiota, they did not seem to have inflammatory bowel disease. And there is no evidence either of diverticulitis, a condition which has now also become very common. We could not find any evidence of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is now also common. Their intestines were very different from ours. They had a healthy population of microbes which was supporting them, ensuring good intestinal health and good health in many other ways, because in the 19th century, we found very little heart disease or cancer or dementia. This was a population that was extremely well protected. Their intestines were full of the right kinds of microbes. So how much fiber do we eat today? Well, now if you look at the last item on this page, you'll see that today our intakes of prebiotic fiber have fallen from 130 to 30 to 3 grams, a reduction of more than 90% in our intake of prebiotic fiber. So what that means is, well, the population of positive, healthy microbes in our intestines has fallen, and they've been replaced by other bacteria which are not so healthy at all. So traditionally, we would have had intestines full of bacteria which consumed prebiotic fiber. The prebiotic fiber is gone. The new bacteria that have taken the place of the healthy bacteria don't consume prebiotic fiber because it's done there. Instead, many of them consume protein. Not so good for us, and I'll explain why. And in this time, we have seen a huge increase in non-communicable degenerative disease. Is there a link? And we are very certain that indeed there is a link. So there is your healthy gut, healthy diet, lots of prebiotic fiber, lots of probiotic bacteria, which are having a very positive and healthy conversation with our cells. Take the fiber out of the diet, and the probiotic species are reduced in number. They are replaced by bacteria that consume protein. And where do you think they get that protein from? Not from the food we eat. That protein is digested and absorbed in the small intestine. No, they consume proteins that exist in the physiological structure of the large intestine. Now, if you see those two, at the bottom of this picture, there's a line of cells. Above it, there is a yellow, a pale yellow layer. That represents the mucus layer that lies over our cells and protects them. That mucus contains proteins called mucins. The proteolytic bacteria consume these proteins, they break down the mucus layer, and as you can see, they come into direct contact with our cells. The barrier, the filtering barrier I told you about, has gone. They come into direct contact with our cells and cause enormous inflammation. Many of our cells die. Cancerous growth becomes accelerated. The cells themselves start to peel apart. The tight cell junctions are broken. The cells separate, and this is what many people call leaky gut. So now you do not only have problems in the intestines, but toxic compounds, which should normally be kept inside the intestines, are now able to move through the wall of the gut into the bloodstream, where they first affect the liver, and then into the general circulation, where they poison every other tissue in the body. They start to produce some interesting compounds, LL37 up in the top left, that's a cathelicidin, and our cells are producing much more interleukin-1 beta, which is a pro-inflammatory compound, and this has now been associated with an increase in the risk of coronary artery disease and cancer progression. Again, I go back to the WHO data. The people who ate more fiber were protected from vascular disease and cancer. The people who ate less fiber, like the person represented in this graph, in this image, they have more cancer, they have more heart disease. And because the levels of intake of prebiotic fibers are so low today, we see this reflected again and again in our public health statistics. We see more cancer, we see more heart disease, we see more dementia. And the microbiota in your intestines have become no longer positive and supportive. They have become destructive and dangerous and malignant. And it is because we no longer provide the probiotic bacteria, the good ones, with the fuel that they need to grow. So what has happened? Well, first of all, the intestines have been affected. We now see huge increases in irritable bowel syndrome, which affects, I have to admit, it's not particularly well measured, but the best estimate suggests that it now affects up to 14% of the population. Inflammatory bowel disease, much more serious, ulcerative colitis, morbus Crohn. We see and have seen and continue to see very significant increases in this condition in all of those countries which have moved towards the industrial diet, which have left traditional diets behind and which now consume, as we do, large amounts of fast and ultra-processed foods. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is increasing. Didn't exist in the 19th century when people had a healthy microbiota. Now we see reports of this increasing in every country, in every part of the world, where ultra-processed foods with very low levels of prebiotic fiber have taken up a significant share of our diet. We see more diverticulitis, especially in the young. And this is quite shocking because diverticulitis, when I went to medical school, was a disease of old age. We did not expect to see it in young persons. Now it's increasing very rapidly in the young. You could almost say it represents an acceleration of the aging process. And we see the same pattern in the increasing incidence of colorectal cancer in young people. The proportion of cancer of this type in young adults has doubled in the last generation. More evidence of a kind of acceleration of the aging process. And here are the same results in graphic form. These are American data, under 50, that's young for cancer, at least traditionally it was. And every other country which has moved away from a traditional diet to ultra-processed or industrial foods is showing the same alarming pattern. But there are other cancers where we see an even sharper increase. And one of those is cancer of the appendix. This is much less common than colorectal cancer, but the increase is quite staggering, a quadrupling in the last 2 generations. And we have seen more cases in 2023. This is the latest year we have good data for globally, than in the period 1979 to 2019. That's pretty shocking. More cases in 1 year than in the previous 40 years. Now, if you're leaching poison from the gut into the bloodstream, the first place it goes is to the liver. And this is one very important reason why the numbers of people presenting with fatty liver disease, this is something we used to call non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, have been increasing and have now reached 40% of the population. 4 in every 10 people now has this condition. And dysbiosis, not enough prebiotic fibers, the wrong population of microbes in the gut is an important part of this. In fact, this is increasing to such an extent that on current trends, by 2070, the entire population will have fatty liver disease, which in itself is not so serious. But this is an early stage of the problem. Over time, many of these cases will become cirrhotic. That is, they will start to involve scarring, and that is actually a precancerous condition. And this is one reason why the frequency of a couple of liver cancers are also starting to increase. Everything is moving negatively. And a great deal of this can be clearly related to our reduced intakes of prebiotic fiber. And now we have new evidence to show that if you increase the amount of prebiotic fiber that you eat, this is in fact protective against colon cancer and this type of liver disease. No evidence yet as to whether it protects against cancer of the appendix, but I believe that will also prove to be the case once clinical trials are complete. Now, I won't go into all of this in detail. It's fairly technical. This is something that I teach my students, but I only put this slide up to show to you that the relationship between lack of prebiotic fiber and a subsequent distortion of the bacterial population of the gut, we know in some detail how this affects the local immune system in a way which would reduce your ability to ward off cancer. From that, it seems very logical to us that by putting prebiotic fiber back into the diet, the risk of all of these cancers and metabolic disorders would be reduced, not only in the gut, but cancer in other tissues as well. Again, I go back to the WHO paper I showed you at the beginning, which indicated that eating more fiber was protective against not only fiber in the intestines, cancer in the intestines, but also breast cancer. And we have evidence of some other cancer risk reduction in other tissues as well. The gut-brain connection comes in place here. Now, in order to explain this, I have to talk a little bit about the dynamic nature of the brain. In the brain, in a healthy brain cells are continually being formed throughout life in a subcortical structure called the hippocampus. Brain cells are continually being created and making new connections. They repopulate the cortices, and this is an important factor in maintaining brain integrity and function through middle age and into old age. But the brain is dynamic in another way too. When you learn something, the nerves are growing out, they're making new connections, and that helps to consolidate memory. But when you forget something, or the old model is no longer true and you forget it and learn something else, the connections you made previously shrink back. So the nerves grow during learning and they shrink back during forgetting. Now, if you have the wrong population of microbes in the gut and you are leaching poisons into the bloodstream, this creates inflammation in the body and also in the brain. Under these conditions, nerves are less able to grow and make new connections, which means you become less able to learn. And the nerves are more likely to start breaking connections and shrinking back, which means you become more forgetful. And if you maintain neuroinflammatory stress, more of those brain cells will die. And this is one reason why the WHO study found that people who ate more fiber were protected against dementia. Those who ate less fiber were more likely to have dementia. But dementia takes decades to develop. What happens in a shorter term? Well, if you have a leaky gut, you're leaking toxins into the blood, you're poisoning the brain and other tissues and causing neuroinflammation, you will have more pain. You'll suffer more from chronic pain. There will be a higher risk of anxiety and depression. There is reduced motivation. There is anhedonism, that is, people find less interest and pleasure in being in the world. In short, you create Generation X, who seem to be suffering from neuroinflammation in a very general sense. And when you look at their diet, it is no surprise why. The Generation X diet contains very little prebiotic fiber. And if you're unlucky enough to be in the womb while your mother is eating such a diet, well, in the second and third trimesters, the brain is starting to grow, nerves are getting to the right place, they're finding the right place to innovate, and they're navigating a very complicated three-dimensional map using chemical gradients and probably electrical fields to find the right contacts. If the mother is eating the wrong diet, has the wrong population of microbes, has this chronic poisoning taking place, and has neuroinflammatory stress, well, that inflammatory stress affects the growth of the central nervous system of the fetus in the womb. It interferes with the nerve's ability to find the right targets to grow to. And this has now been linked to neurodevelopmental diseases such as autism and ADHD, conditions like that, but also schizophrenia, which is now being repositioned as a late onset neurodevelopmental disorder. And the data shows quite clearly we're seeing more neurodevelopmental disease and more schizophrenia. More evidence that dysbiosis, the wrong microbes in the gut, leads to brain damage. We now know that irritable inflammatory bowel disease, which is characterized by dysbiosis, doubles the risk of dementia and has a very similar impact on the risk of developing Parkinsonism. So the links, circumstantial, you might say, but there are many of them. They're very persuasive. They all point in the same direction. I won't go into this. There's too much detail, but anyone who wishes to know more, please visit my blog. I write about these topics in much more detail at drpaulclayton.iu. So as I said, the neurodevelopmental diseases and schizophrenia are increasing in all the developed nations. We know that inflammation, if the infant in the womb, if the fetus in the womb is exposed to inflammatory stress, there is both preclinical data, animal models, and increasingly we have human epidemiology studies which show that the chronic inflammatory stress leads to a kind of a miswiring or a misidentification of targeting in the central nervous system. And there is evidence now starting to emerge that if you give animals that are exposed to inflammatory stress, if you give them more prebiotic fiber, then the risk of their offspring developing symptoms which are the equivalent to neurodevelopmental diseases in human is reduced. It works really very effectively in animal models. Excuse me. And I think that based on the machinery that has been identified here, it will be protective, very protective in humans as well. So any woman who is in the early stages of pregnancy or is planning to start a family, I think it makes extremely good sense for someone like that to use prebiotic fibers, to take them, add them to the diet prophylactically to protect not only her health, but the health of her unborn children. Um, yep. I said that if you had neuroinflammatory stress, this induced increased feelings of pain, anxiety, and depression. All of these things are increasing. We see increasing numbers of deaths of despair, certainly in the United States, where they now account for more than 100,000 deaths per year. And we know that if this neuroinflammation is maintained over long periods of time, which it is, given today's modern diet, there will be more nerve damage over time, leading to more neurodegenerative disease. Uh, Protective factors are emerging. The prebiotic fibers are clearly protective, and clinical studies show that they exert therapeutic effect in depression and anxiety. And the reason how they're able to do this is because they're normalizing the population of microbes in the intestine, stabilizing the intestine, and stopping the leaching of poisons into the bloodstream. And there is some preliminary data which indicates that by adding prebiotic fibers to the diet, many cases of chronic pain improve as well. I'll mention one more study here. This is the Brazilian arm of the ELSA study, which is a multinational study. The Brazilian arm of this was looking at neurodegenerative disease, and they found that those adults who consumed the least prebiotic fiber, as over time, they moved much more rapidly towards a loss of cognitive function associated with dementia. The less fiber they were eating, the more likely they were to develop the clinical symptoms of dementia. Prebiotics, we have every reason to believe, will be protective against that. And more circumstantial evidence for this comes from other research, which shows that if you eat a very low prebiotic diet, over time, the hippocampus, and this is the very important part of the brain where brain cells are continually being formed, but if you're eating very little prebiotic fiber and a generally pro-inflammatory diet, as you get older, the hippocampus itself becomes disorganized and damaged, and it actually physically shrinks. It is no longer capable of repopulating the cortices with new brain cells. Very common amongst people today. In fact, it occurs so commonly because so many people eat the industrial diet that we thought previously this was a sign of aging. But it's not, because when you look at people who eat a traditional diet, what we find is that their hippocampus does not decay with age. And in fact, such populations do not develop dementia with age either. And Parkinsonism is extremely rare, almost non-existent. So all of these symptoms of an aging brain, which we think of as a necessary part of aging because it is so common amongst our populations, these are avoidable. And they are avoided in cultures which consume higher intakes of prebiotics and have, as a result, a healthy population of microbes in their intestines. I did say that the gut connects to many other tissues. I'll talk a little bit about fertility. We know that dysbiosis, having the wrong population of microbes, is strongly linked to polycystic ovary syndrome, which is a common cause of infertility, female infertility. I won't go into all of this. I just want to show you that the way in which dysbiosis leads to polycystic ovary syndrome has been demonstrated, I think, to everyone's satisfaction. There is both animal model data and clinical data to prove this. And very recently, it has been shown that by taking more prebiotic fibers into the diet and restoring a healthy microbiota, that the symptoms of this condition recede, and some cases go into complete remission. Toxic preeclampsia. Well, this doesn't necessarily reduce fertility, but it is a significant cause of both fetal and maternal death. It is alarming to see that there is evidence that this condition is affecting more and more younger mothers. We know that neuroinflammation is involved. We know that if it's untreated, it leads to brain damage, permanent brain damage, and a disruption of normal blood flow at the placenta, between the fetal and the maternal blood circulation systems is very much involved. And we know that this is dysregulated by local inflammatory stress in the placenta. If you have dysbiosis in the intestine, the microbes in the intestine communicate and translocate to other tissues. So if you have dysbiosis in the intestines because you don't eat enough prebiotic fiber, this has now been related to having the wrong population of microbes in the placenta, which then cause inflammation there and interfere with the normal exchange of oxygen and nutrients across the placenta. The machinery, once again, has been elucidated, and although no study has yet been done, there is some evidence, circumstantial again, that adding more prebiotic fibers into the diet should be protective against developing this condition. From female infertility to male infertility. This well-known graph shows the decline over really no more than 2 generations of sperm counts of approximately 60%. This has been found in many parts of the world. The red trace in the right-hand side represents more recent studies which show that, if anything, this decline in sperm counts is accelerating. And it is accompanied by findings of reduced levels of testosterone. So males are becoming less fertile, they're becoming less masculine. This is telling us something important. Both testosterone and the spermatozoa are produced in the testes. And the testes operate under very narrowly defined conditions. If you have chronic inflammatory stress and if you have endotoxemia, that is poisons leaching from the intestines, because you have the wrong population of microbes there, we know that this attacks and damages the function of the testes. So this is responsible, at least in part, for declining fertility in men and men becoming less masculine. There is evidence, not yet based on clinical trials, but from the considerable numbers of clients and patients that I've seen, and that many other people in Encino have seen, that by putting these fibers back into the diet, in many cases, fertility is restored. And we see behaviors which indicate that testosterone levels are increasing as well. So here is the current situation. The diet does not contain enough prebiotic fiber. There is inflammation in the intestines. The gut becomes leaky. Toxins are leaching out into the bloodstream, affecting the liver, the heart, the brain, many other tissues besides. How can we rectify this? The answer is simple. Put prebiotic fibers back into the diet where they always used to be. Restore a microbial population that is no longer aggressive and toxic, but that actually helps and supports us. And these are the tools that we use. This is the simplest prebiotic fiber. Any biochemist can see that this is a carbohydrate, but it's a carbohydrate that we cannot digest. And so it passes through the small intestine intact into the large intestine, where it is broken down by bacteria in a reaction that is technically a fermentation. This is phos, very small molecules. When the bacteria consume them, they consume them like beads on a chain, one fructose and then another and another. And because these molecules are so short, the bacteria consume them rapidly. So we combine them with larger amounts of inulin, similar molecule, much longer, so the fermentation is slower. We add larger amounts of 1,3,1,4 beta-glucans from oats, larger molecule, slower fermentation. And larger amounts again of resistant starch from sources such as green banana, that's a common source. Much larger molecule, much more complicated, much slower fermentation. So why do we need the different prebiotic fibers? Well, the answer is simple. When you consume this blend of fibers and they enter into the large intestine, everything is moving. So the small fibers, the phos, ferment first, changing the population from unhealthy towards healthy. And then the inulin takes over, and then the oat beta-glucans, and finally the resistant starch. And in this way, we change the population of the entire large intestine. It's not as neat as this. This is just a diagram to show you that it's a kind of a relay race. The small, rapidly acting fibers acting first, acting a bit like the blue touch paper on a firework. They start the reaction, and then it is contained throughout the transverse and descending and colon, all the way through to the end of the intestinal tract. But in order to achieve that, you need all of these fibers of different length, complexity, and fermentation rate. Now, we know that there are other compounds that you eat that have direct and indirect effects on the microbial population. Polyphenols come in here, and in fact, we think some of their positive effects on the body are actually generated by the microbiota, if it's a healthy microbiota, which break the polyphenols down into more active metabolites. We know that the omega-3s play a role here too, not directly because they're absorbed in the small intestine, but they affect the functioning of the gut and secretions that are produced by the gut, and they have secondary effects on the microbiota. The problem is that all of these compounds, the omega-3s, the polyphenols, and the prebiotic fibers, all of them have been reduced and taken away from the modern diet. And this is a very important reason why we see not just more gastrointestinal diseases, but more chronic degenerative disease of all kinds. This is the basis, one of the reasons why I designed the health protocol, which replaces all of these nutrients that used to be present in the traditional diet, which have been taken away. All we're doing is putting them back in. And when you do that, effectively you become your own blue zone. When you do that, many of the conditions that affect large numbers of the population today over time fade, they eventually disappear, and many people become pharmaceutically independent. Before I start, let me credit the work of Martina Torresen, who sits on the scientific advisory board at Zinzino. She is a first-class scientist, and she did most of the work that culminated in the development of the gut test. And it starts with tryptophan, a very interesting amino acid. And many people know that it is a precursor for serotonin, or 5-HT. People think of that as the neurotransmitter of happiness. That's not completely true, but people think that. It also produces melatonin, which is important in the regulation of sleep patterns. Yep, tryptophan does all that, but there are two other pathways, and one of those is something known as the indole pathway. And through this route, can you see my cursor? The tryptophan produces a number of compounds, including IPA in the bottom left of that box, which stands for indole propionic acid. Very important metabolite, powerful anti-inflammatory, but very neuroprotective. That is, it maintains the health of brain cells. Very important. And there's a third pathway, which is called the kynurenine pathway. And the tryptophan that's metabolized in this box on the left, it forms a number of compounds, including kynurenic acid and quinolinic acid, that are actually potentially very toxic. They have been implicated in cardiovascular disease and in a kind of rundown of the mitochondria in your body's cells. If the mitochondria become compromised, they do not produce as much energy. Your tissues don't have enough energy available to them. You become run down. Function becomes less. This is a large part of the aging process. And if too much tryptophan is going to the left-hand side of this diagram and being taken down the road towards quinolinic acid that accelerates aging. Why would more tryptophan be metabolized in this way? Well, that depends on the activation of this enzyme here in the upper left, up in the top of the left box. You can see TDO, IDO. These are enzymes that are switched on by chronic inflammation, particularly in the intestines. If you don't have enough prebiotic fiber, you have chronic inflammation in the wall of the intestines. Now you will produce more kynurenine, more quinolinic acid. If you have inflammation, less tryptophan is available to form IPA in the right-hand box, and more of it is metabolized over on the left-hand side towards kynureninic acid and quinolinic acid. So the more inflammation you have, the higher the ratio of kynureninic acid to IPA. And this is one of the things that we measure in the test. So IPA is very protective. And if you can form more IPA, which you do if you have prebiotic fiber, because that supports the growth of bacteria that produce IPA, and it downregulates inflammation, so there's less kynureninic acid. So by eating more fiber, you promote IPA and you reduce kynureninic acid. By eating more fiber, according to the WHO, you are protecting your health in very many, very important ways. You don't want to have too much kynureninic acid because that is associated with a whole series of very substantial problems. So it's important to have a high IPA to kynureninic acid ratio. And that is fundamentally what the test is all about. And you might ask, well, if the kynurenine pathway is so destructive, why do we even have it? Very simply, we need it because all species have it. It's one way in which we protect ourselves from infection. And if it's activated every now and then, working at a low level, it does that quite well. But the problem is, take fibers out of the diet, you have more inflammation, you have more tryptophan being metabolized to kynureninic acid, much, much too much. And now it becomes destructive. And now it leads to damage to many other healthy tissues. So the solution is simple. Increase the amount of prebiotic fiber in the diet, restore a healthy IPA to kynurenine ratio, and at that point, you're moving towards good health as opposed to disease. Now, I don't want to go into all of the data here. That's too much detail. If any of you are interested and want to look at this in more detail, you can go to Martina Torreson's notes, which are available on the Syncina website. Alternatively, you can visit my blog, where I'm currently writing a post about exactly all of this, which will be complete with 120 scientific references that you can use to go back into the literature and test these statements for yourself. So that is the basis of the test. It follows everything that we know about prebiotic fiber, how it works, how it protects you. Our aim is to restore the traditional diet and the traditional patterns of health, where chronic degenerative disease was much less common than it is today. This is not rocket science. All we're doing is reanalyzing the traditional diets with modern science and using that to recreate the elements of the traditional diet in a way that we believe will protect your health. Thank you.